47 men earned the Medal of Honor. Most received it posthumously. Their families entrusted those medals to a museum, not to own, but to preserve their names. Then an HOA board member bulldozed the building because the flagpole cast a shadow on her pool at 4 p.m. When the National Medal of Honor Society heard what she had done, they didn't send a lawyer. They sent 19 living recipients. Jack Morrison spent his life savings building that museum. He gathered each medal personally from families who'd lost sons in 3 wars. Then Karen Whitfield, the HOA president, called the flagpole a nuisance and had the museum bulldozed. She didn't call the police. She just crushed 47 medals of honor into the dirt. What she didn't know, Morrison had spent 30 years earning the trust of a very particular fraternity. 3 days later, 19 men in blazers with pale blue ribbons stepped off a bus. They weren't there to discuss property values. To understand why 19 Medal of Honor recipients got on a bus to a small Ohio town, you have to go back 4 years. To Jack Morrison, 64 years old, retired high school history teacher, never married. His father, Private First Class William Morrison, died on Omaha Beach in 1944. He left Jack a single photograph, a Purple Heart, and a lifelong question: who were the men who didn't come home and who remembers their names? Jack spent 30 years answering that question. He traveled to every state, met the families of Medal of Honor recipients from World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. Most of those families had no idea what to do with the medals. They sat in shoe boxes, in attic trunks, gathering dust. So Jack made each family a promise: let me hold them. Not own them, just hold them. I'll display them, keep the stories alive. 47 families said yes. They entrusted him with 47 Medals of Honor, each the highest military award the nation can bestow. He used his savings, about $180,000, to buy an old firehouse on Cherry Street in Millbrook, Ohio. He converted it into a small museum, no admission fee, just a donation box by the door. The walls were lined with photographs, letters, and the pale blue ribbons of the medals. Under each medal, a name and a story. Private Desmond Cruz, who held a hill alone for 6 hours. Sergeant First Class Earl Manning, who threw himself on a grenade. Their families visited often. The museum became a quiet pilgrimage site for veterans and history students. It was never about money. It was about memory. But here's the thing about memory: it requires a building. And the building was right next door to Karen Whitfield. Karen Whitfield was the president of the Millbrook Estates Homeowners Association. She lived in a 5,000-square-foot colonial revival with a heated saltwater pool that she swam in every afternoon at precisely 4 p.m. Her world was order, compliance, and the unshakable belief that rules existed for people like her to enforce against people like Jack Morrison. The trouble started within 6 months of the museum opening. Jack installed a 20-foot flagpole in the front garden and flew a nylon American flag that he illuminated at night. It was visible from the street. It cast a shadow. At 4 p.m. in the summer months, that shadow fell across Karen Whitfield's pool deck for approximately 19 minutes. She filed her first complaint in writing. The flagpole violates the community's architectural guidelines. It's a visual nuisance. The light shines into my bedroom. The visitors park on the street. Jack received a letter from the HOA with a fine of $50 per day until the flagpole was removed. He appealed. He explained the museum's purpose. He offered to adjust the position, but Karen had already made up her mind. You don't get special treatment just because you're flying a flag. Rules are rules. The HOA board, composed of 3 of Karen's close friends, rejected his appeal. Jack was fined without relief. Then came the anonymous calls to code enforcement. The county inspectors showed up at least twice a month, checking for unpermitted renovations, fire code violations, parking infractions. Each time they found nothing, but each visit was logged and used by Karen to justify more restrictions. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts, but Jack kept the museum open. He paid the fines with his dwindling retirement funds. He stayed open for the school groups and the old vets who needed to see that someone still honored their friends. And he never took down the flagpole. That infuriated Karen. Then in August of last year, Karen found her weapon. The firehouse had a flat roof. The original building plans filed in 1958 had specified a peaked roof, but the flat roof had been a cost-saving measure at the time. a minor discrepancy, but legally, the building was out of compliance. Karen petitioned the county for a demolition order on the grounds that the structure was unpermitted and unsafe. She hired her own inspector, a man named Dale Eckert, who had inspected 6 of her previous HOA targets, and his report declared the building a hazard. The county approved the demolition, giving Jack 30 days to vacate. Jack scrambled. He hired a lawyer, filed for an injunction, but Karen's connections moved faster. On September 11th of all days, Jack was in court trying to get an emergency stay. He didn't know that while he sat in that courtroom, Karen had already hired a demolition crew. She told them the owner had abandoned the property, that the order was final. And that morning, a bulldozer reduced 47 medals of honor to rubble. The photographs, the letters, the medals, everything was buried under brick and drywall. Jack arrived to find his life's work flattened. And Karen Whitfield stood on her patio, watching. She didn't say a word. But here's what Karen didn't understand. Jack Morrison had spent 3 decades building relationships with the families of those medal recipients. And those families included living members of the Medal of Honor Society. When Jack called and told them what had happened, the response was immediate. The society's president, a retired colonel who had received the medal in Vietnam, didn't call a lawyer. He called a bus company. He spent 3 days calling the other living recipients. 19 of them agreed to come to Millbrook, Ohio. 19 old men whose average age was 74. They put on their blazers, pinned the pale blue ribbon with the 5 white stars to their lapels, and boarded a bus before sunrise. The bus pulled up to Cherry Street at 10 a.m. on September 14th, 3 days after the bulldozer. All 19 men stepped off and lined up shoulder to shoulder in front of the wreckage. The neighborhood went silent. Karen Whitfield looked out her kitchen window and saw them. She had no idea who they were, but she knew something terrible was about to happen. The last man off the bus was a silver-haired man with a cane. He walked to the edge of the debris, bent down painfully, and picked up a dented star from the dirt. Then he turned toward Karen's house. The man with the cane was Colonel Thomas Redding, United States Army, retired. He received his Medal of Honor in 1968 for action in the Chao Valley. He was 79 years old, and the dented star in his hand had belonged to Private Desmond Cruz, who died alone on a hill in Korea at 19. Redding held it up to the morning light so that every person on that street could see. Then he spoke, his voice carrying with the kind of command that doesn't require a microphone. "Private Cruz, I've got you. We're going to get you out of the dirt." The other 18 medal recipients did not speak. They didn't have to. They simply stood in formation, facing the debris, and then one by one they began to salute. 19 old men with 19 medals, saluting the pile of rubble that contained 47 more. The silence was heavier than any bulldozer. Inside her kitchen, Karen Whitfield watched through the blinds. She had expected Jack Morrison to come back crying, to beg, to plead. She had not expected a busload of decorated war heroes standing in her neighborhood like a living monument. She grabbed her phone and called the Millbrook Police Department, demanding they remove the trespassers. The dispatcher asked who was trespassing. Karen said, "Some old men in suits, I don't know, they're on the museum property." The dispatcher paused and then said, "Ma'am, that property is a public street and sidewalk. They have a right to be there." Karen slammed the phone down. She called her husband, who was at his office in Columbus, and screamed that the situation was escalating. Her husband, a corporate lawyer named Richard Whitfield, told her to stay inside and not talk to anyone. But it was already too late, because by 10:30 that morning, a local news crew had arrived. A stringer for the Columbus Dispatch had heard the police scanner chatter about a gathering on Cherry Street and drove out to see what was happening. When he saw the line of Medal of Honor recipients, he started taking pictures. Those pictures hit the internet by noon. By 2 p.m., the national media had the story. CNN, Fox News, the Associated Press, they all ran variations of the same headline: 19 Medal of Honor recipients stand guard over Bulldozed Museum. The photographs went viral. 19 elderly men with pale blue ribbons around their necks, standing in front of flattened brick and splintered wood, an American flag half buried in the debris behind them. The image was devastating in its simplicity. But the real escalation happened inside Colonel Redding's pocket. He had not come to Millbrook just to stand and salute. He had come with a folder, and inside that folder was what he called his insurance policy. 3 days before the bus left, he had asked the Medal of Honor Society's legal counsel to quietly investigate Karen Whitfield and the Millbrook Estates HOA. What they found was astonishing. Karen Whitfield was not just a petty tyrant with a pool. She was the wife of Richard Whitfield, a partner at Whitfield, Barton and Keene, the law firm that represented one of the largest real estate development firms in Ohio. That firm, Landmark Development Group, had been quietly buying up properties around Millbrook for the past 2 years. They had plans for a luxury retail complex, and the old firehouse on Cherry Street was one of the few parcels they hadn't been able to acquire. Jack Morrison had refused every offer. So Karen Whitfield, the HOA president, had used her position to manufacture a demolition order. Colonel Redding had the evidence. Emails between Karen and her husband's firm showed coordination. The county inspector who condemned the building, Dale Eckert, had been paid $15,000 as a consultant by Landmark Development Group 6 months before his inspection. It was a conspiracy. Jack Morrison's museum was not destroyed because of a flagpole shadow. It was destroyed because it was standing in the way of a $15 million development deal. When this information leaked, and it did leak, first through a reporter at the Columbus Dispatch who got an anonymous tip, the entire narrative shifted. This was no longer a dispute between a retired teacher and a difficult neighbor. This was a criminal conspiracy involving real estate fraud, bribery, and the desecration of military honors. Karen found out about the leak at 3 p.m. that afternoon. Her husband called her, his voice shaking. He said the firm had just been contacted by the FBI. The Medal of Honor Society had filed a formal criminal complaint, citing the evidence of bribery and conspiracy. Because the medals were federal property on loan to the museum, the destruction constituted federal crimes. Richard told Karen to get a lawyer immediately. He then said something that chilled her blood. "I can't protect you on this one." The next morning, Dale Eckert, the corrupt inspector, was arrested at his home by FBI agents. He would later turn state's evidence, admitting that Karen Whitfield had orchestrated the entire scheme and that her husband's firm had facilitated the bribe. Landmark Development Group immediately released a statement denying all involvement and announcing they were severing ties with the Whitfield law firm. But the medal recipients were not finished. Colonel Redding held a press conference on the sidewalk in front of the Rubble. He stood with Jack Morrison at his side and the other 18 recipients behind him. He did not shout. He did not grandstand. He simply said, 47 heroes are buried in this dirt. Their medals are somewhere under these bricks. The men who put them there thought they were just crushing an old man's project. They didn't understand what they were crushing, but were going to teach them. He then announced a national fundraising campaign to rebuild the museum, bigger and better, on the same site. Within 48 hours, over $2 million had been donated. The money poured in from veterans, from military families, from ordinary Americans who saw the photograph of 19 old soldiers saluting a pile of rubble. A construction company in Cincinnati offered to rebuild the entire museum for free. A security firm offered a lifetime contract to protect it. The governor of Ohio, facing immense public pressure, called for a full state investigation into the county permitting process. And Karen Whitfield, she became the most hated woman in America for a solid week. Her address was published online. Protesters gathered outside her house, not violent, just silent. They held signs with the names of the 47 medal recipients. Someone projected their faces onto the side of her house at night. She couldn't leave. She couldn't sleep. The media camped outside her gate. Her HOA board resigned en masse. Her husband was fired from his law firm. Her children were pulled out of school after classmates refused to sit with them. But Karen had one move left. She had been recording everything. Every conversation with Jack Morrison, every meeting with her board, every phone call. She had a cache of documents she believed would prove that Jack had been the aggressor all along, that he had harassed her, that the flagpole was illegal, that the demolition was a legitimate enforcement action. And on the 5th day after the bulldozer, she handed all of it to a new attorney, a notorious defamation lawyer from Cleveland named Marcus Sloan. He was known for taking cases nobody else would touch, and winning them through sheer aggression. Sloan held his own press conference. He stood in front of Karen's house, the protesters still across the street, and declared that his client was the true victim. He called Jack Morrison a manipulative con man who had exploited grieving families to steal their medals. He claimed the museum was a fire trap, that the demolition was an act of public safety, and that the Medal of Honor Society had been duped. He announced he was filing a multi-million-dollar defamation lawsuit against Jack Morrison, the Medal of Honor Society, and the news outlets that had covered the story. He also filed an emergency motion to have the fundraising halted, arguing that Jack Morrison could not be trusted with the money. The move was so audacious, so brazen, that it briefly worked. The fundraising platform froze the donations pending a review. Some news outlets pulled back on their coverage, afraid of legal exposure. Jack Morrison, who had been riding a wave of support, suddenly found himself alone in a legal battle he couldn't afford. He sat in his rented apartment, staring at a pile of legal threats, and for the first time since the bulldozer, he felt defeated. But then Colonel Redding reappeared at his door. He had a new folder, thicker than the first. He sat down across from Jack and opened it. Inside were records, witness statements, and a very specific document that would change everything. Redding looked at Jack and said, "She thinks she can use the law to bury you. So we're going to bury her with a law she's never heard of." He pushed the document across the table. It was a federal statute, Title 18, Section 700, the Stolen Valor Act, and it also included something else, a precedent regarding the desecration of military decorations. If they could prove Karen Whitfield knowingly destroyed the Medals of Honor, she wasn't facing a lawsuit. She was facing 10 years in federal prison. Jack Morrison stared at the document Colonel Redding had placed on the table. Title 18, Section 700, Desecration of Military Medals, a federal felony punishable by up to 10 years imprisonment. He looked up at Redding, his voice barely a whisper. "Can we prove she knew?" Redding opened the second folder. Inside was the transcript of an email Karen Whitfield had sent to Dale Eckert 6 days before the demolition. The email read, "The old man has a bunch of medals in display cases. They'll be removed before the bulldozer arrives. I'll handle that personally." She had known. She had not just wanted the building gone. She had specifically acknowledged the medals and planned to remove them. But then she didn't. Or worse, she removed them and destroyed them separately. The FBI had already seized Karen's home computers and her phone. The forensic team found that on the morning of September 11th, while Jack was in court, Karen had sent a text to the demolition foreman. "Don't wait for the owner. Go now. Everything inside is junk." The foreman, a man named Gary Dobbs, later testified that when he asked about the display cases with the medals, Karen had told him they were worthless replicas and to crush them. He had followed orders. This was the smoking gun. Not just negligence, not just a property dispute gone wrong. Willful, knowing destruction of the nation's highest military decorations. The FBI arrested Karen Whitfield at her home on September 20th, 9 days after the demolition. She was charged with 3 federal counts: conspiracy to commit wire fraud, bribery of a public official, and desecration of military medals. She was led out of her colonial revival in handcuffs, while protesters chanted the names of the 47 dead. But the story didn't end there. Because when the FBI searched Karen's basement, they found a locked filing cabinet. Inside were records of 7 other properties that had been targeted by the Millbrook Estates HOA over the past decade. Each one had been acquired by Landmark Development Group shortly after the HOA forced the owner out. A retired nurse who lost her family home. A small church that was condemned on a technicality. An elderly couple who died penniless after Karen's fines drove them into bankruptcy. The pattern was systemic. Karen Whitfield had been running a small empire of theft, one demolition at a time. The revelation triggered a cascade. The Ohio Attorney General announced a statewide investigation into HOA abuse. The FBI expanded its probe to include Landmark Development Group, which led to the indictment of its CEO and 2 board members. Richard Whitfield, Karen's husband, saw the walls closing in. He approached federal prosecutors with an offer to cooperate. He provided testimony that his firm had knowingly drafted fraudulent legal documents to support the HOA's actions. He admitted that he and Karen had discussed the museum specifically, that they saw Jack Morrison as an obstacle to a $15 million deal, and that Karen had laughed about how easy it was to get the demolition approved. His cooperation deal meant Karen was now utterly alone. Her defamation attorney, Marcus Sloan, withdrew from the case, citing irreconcilable differences after Karen refused to follow his advice to settle. She was left with a public defender who had little interest in defending the most hated woman in America. The fundraising freeze was lifted when the Medal of Honor Society demonstrated that all funds were held in an escrow account independent of Jack Morrison. Donations surged past $5 million. Then came the moment that broke Karen entirely. At her bail hearing, the prosecution called a surprise witness. Colonel Thomas Redding entered the courtroom, his cane tapping on the floor, the pale blue ribbon around his neck. He did not sit in the gallery. He walked to the witness stand, was sworn in, and faced Karen directly. The prosecutor asked him what the Medal of Honor represented. Redding spoke for 10 minutes. He described the men who had earned them. He named all 47 whose medals had been destroyed and described how each had died. He then held up a small evidence bag. Inside was a twisted piece of metal, the remnant of Desmond Cruz's star recovered from the debris. "Mrs. Whitfield," Redding said, his voice steady, "you told the demolition crew these were worthless replicas. I want you to know what you actually destroyed." This star was awarded to Private First Class Desmond Cruz. He was 19 years old. He held a hill in Korea for 6 hours against a battalion of enemy soldiers. He was shot 17 times. He died alone in the snow so that his friends could retreat. When they found his body, he was still holding his rifle. The medal his mother received had his name engraved on the back. "You destroyed it with a bulldozer because it cast a shadow on your pool." The courtroom was silent. Karen Whitfield, for the first time, began to cry. Not out of remorse, her defenders would later claim, but because she finally understood the magnitude of what she had done. The judge denied bail. Karen was taken back to a holding cell. The trial was scheduled for March 15th, 6 months after the demolition. But the outcome was already being shaped by forces beyond the courtroom. The Medal of Honor Society had mobilized not just for legal justice, but for a deeper form of accountability. Colonel Redding announced a March of Honor for the day before the trial. All living Medal of Honor recipients who could travel would gather in Millbrook. They would stand vigil at the site of the old museum. They would read aloud the names of the 47. And then they would attend the trial, sitting in the front row, so that every time Karen Whitfield looked up from her defense table, she would see the faces of the men whose brothers she had desecrated. The night before the trial, Jack Morrison walked through the empty lot on Cherry Street. The debris had been cleared. The ground was leveled. In the center, a temporary shrine had been erected by volunteers. 47 small white crosses, each with a name and a photograph. A flag flew at full staff, illuminated by a single spotlight. Jack knelt and placed his hand on his father's purple heart, which he always wore on a chain around his neck. He had been fighting for 30 years to remember the dead. Tomorrow, he would finally get justice for them. But as he rose to leave, his phone buzzed. A text from Colonel Redding. "Karen's lawyer just filed a last-minute motion. She's claiming she's not mentally fit to stand trial. We have 1 hour to respond." The fight was not over yet. It was about to get even uglier. The emergency hearing was held at 7:30 that evening, an hour after Karen's motion landed. Her new lawyer argued that the intense public anger, the media coverage, and the stress of the case had rendered her incompetent to participate in her own defense. They submitted a psychologist's report claiming acute anxiety disorder. The prosecutor, a sharp federal attorney named Michelle Okonkwo, stood up and eviscerated the argument in under 3 minutes. She pointed out that Karen had managed to write detailed emails to her lawyer, coordinate a press strategy, and maintain a social media presence up until the day of her arrest. The judge agreed. Motion denied. The trial would start at 9 a.m. as scheduled. The next morning, the courtroom was packed. Every seat filled, overflow rooms opened, television cameras in the hallway. The 19 Medal of Honor recipients who had stood in the rubble now sat in the first 3 rows of the gallery, their ribbons displayed. Jack Morrison sat behind the prosecution, his father's purple heart visible on his lapel. Karen Whitfield, wearing a grey pantsuit no amount of money could make look confident, sat at the defense table with hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. The trial lasted 4 days, but really, it was over by lunch on the first. The prosecution called Dale Eckert, the corrupt inspector, who described in humiliating detail how Karen had paid him $15,000, how she'd taken him to lunch at a country club and laid out the whole plan over crab cakes, how she'd laughed about the medals in a box and told him not to worry about them. He was on the stand for 2 hours, and every single word was a nail in her coffin. They called the demolition foreman, Gary Dobbs, who repeated what he'd told the FBI. Karen knew the medals were there. She called them replicas. She told him to crush everything. The defense tried to argue that Dobbs was unreliable, a heavy equipment operator with a drinking problem and a grudge. But his testimony was calm, consistent, and backed up by the text messages on Karen's own phone. They called Richard Whitfield, Karen's husband, who testified under a cooperation agreement. He described the late-night conversations, the strategy sessions, the way Karen had obsessed over the museum because its presence lowered their property value and because Jack Morrison had turned down 3 separate purchase offers. He admitted that Karen had said, "If he won't sell, I'll make sure he's got nothing left to sell." He then broke down on the stand, not for his wife, but for himself, for the career and life he had lost. It was pathetic, but it was devastating for the defense. Karen's lawyer tried to build a case around selective enforcement, claiming that the HOA had always acted within its rights, that the demolition had been legally permitted, that the flags and medals were afterthoughts. But the evidence kept piling up. The emails, the payments, the witness testimony, the countless other families who had been victimized over the years. By day 3, Karen knew she was done. On day 4, against her lawyer's advice, she took the stand in her own defense. It was a catastrophe. Under cross-examination, she fell apart. She tried to blame her husband. She tried to blame the HOA board. She tried to blame the county. She said she was misunderstood, that she respected veterans, that her own grandfather had served in the Navy. Michelle Okonkwo asked her if she knew the names of any of the 47 men whose medals she had destroyed. Karen couldn't name a single one. The silence that followed felt like a verdict already delivered. The jury deliberated for 90 minutes. Guilty on all 3 counts: conspiracy, bribery, and desecration of military medals. The judge scheduled sentencing for the following month, but the maximum penalty was clear: up to 10 years in federal prison. When the verdict was read, the 19 medal recipients rose to their feet in unison and saluted, not the judge, not the prosecutors, but the jury. The jurors, many of them crying, didn't know what to do, so they just nodded back. Karen Whitfield was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, 5 years supervised release, and ordered to pay restitution of $4.7 million to the families whose medals had been destroyed and to Jack Morrison. The restitution was largely symbolic because Karen was financially ruined, but the judgment would follow her forever. Her colonial revival was seized and sold at auction. The proceeds went to the Museum Rebuilding Fund. The saltwater pool, where the shadow had first fallen, was filled in and turned into a memorial garden. The new museum opened 1 year later, on September 11th, exactly 1 year after the demolition. It was not a firehouse anymore. It was a modern, 2-story building with climate-controlled display cases, a research library, and a flagpole that rose 47 feet into the Ohio sky. The 19 Medal of Honor recipients who had ridden that bus now stood at the entrance, cutting the ribbon with Jack Morrison. Every single one of the 47 names was engraved on a marble wall, and inside, in a place of honor, was the original twisted star of Desmond Cruz, recovered from the debris and carefully restored as much as possible. It was no longer a medal. It was a relic, a reminder of what was almost lost. The opening ceremony was broadcast nationally. Colonel Redding spoke again, his voice thinner now, but no less commanding. "They tried to bury these names," he said, "but names don't stay buried, they rise, they always rise." Jack Morrison, standing at his side, looked out at the crowd of thousands who had come to witness the reopening. He saw the families of the 47. He saw the school groups. He saw veterans in wheelchairs and young soldiers in dress uniform, and he saw in the very back of the crowd a woman he didn't recognize. She was holding a small box. After the ceremony, the woman approached Jack. She introduced herself as Linda Eckert, the estranged sister of Dale Eckert, the corrupt inspector who had helped Karen. She was trembling. She opened the box. Inside was a Medal of Honor, perfectly intact, its pale blue ribbon clean and pressed. She explained that her brother, Dale, had been unable to destroy it. He had pocketed it before the bulldozer arrived, intending to sell it. But after the arrest, after the story broke, he had given it to her and asked her to return it. He couldn't face Jack himself. The medal belonged to Sergeant First Class Earl Manning, who had thrown himself on a grenade in Vietnam. The Manning family had been told his medal was lost forever. Now it was returned to them. The 48th medal no one had known was missing. Jack took the box, and for the first time since the bulldozer, he wept. That moment became the final image of every news story about the case. Not the rubble, not the trial, but an old man holding a tiny box with a star inside, surrounded by the families of the dead and the 19 living heroes who had refused to let their brothers be erased. The resurrection of Earl Manning's medal symbolized everything that had happened. You can crush a building, you can scatter bricks, but you cannot bury 47 names. And sometimes you cannot even bury 47 medals. One will always find its way back to the light. The story of Karen Whitfield is now over. She sits in a federal prison in West Virginia, her appeals exhausted, her name synonymous with a particular kind of arrogant cruelty. But the story of Jack Morrison and of the museum continues. It stands on Cherry Street today, and if you visit, you will see the 47 names on the wall, and if you look closely, you'll see a small brass plaque beside the entrance. It reads simply, "Here memory outlasted malice." And every morning a flag goes up a 47-foot pole. It casts a shadow. Nobody complains. Here's the thing about this story that sticks with me. Karen Whitfield didn't start by bulldozing a museum. She started by sending a letter about a flagpole. She started by calling code enforcement, by filing complaints, by testing how far she could push before someone pushed back. And for years, nobody did. So she kept going, until she pushed against a retired history teacher who had spent 30 years earning the trust of the most decorated soldiers in American history. The question I keep coming back to is this: how many Karen Whitfields are still out there? Not just in HOAs, but in any position where a little bit of power meets a lot of arrogance. How many people are being bullied right now by someone who's counting on the fact that most of us can't afford to fight? The answer is probably more than we want to admit. But Jack Morrison's story proves something. It proves that the system can work, but only if someone refuses to quit. And sometimes you need backup. In Jack's case, that backup wore blazers with pale blue ribbons and arrived on a bus. I want to hear from you. Have you ever faced an HOA nightmare, a property dispute, a moment where someone with more money or more power tried to steamroll you just because they could? Drop your story in the comments. Let's build something useful here, a library of how regular people fought back and won. The receipts, the strategies, the moments that turn the tide. Because these stories aren't just entertainment. They're a playbook. If this story mattered to you, if it reminded you that memory matters and that good people can still win, hit that subscribe button. I've got a lot more stories like this. Stories about ordinary people who found an extraordinary way to fight back. Stories with paper trails and payoff. Next time on this channel, a city council denied a family's business permit for a ridiculous reason. So the family dug into the municipal code and found a forgotten bylaw that made them untouchable. You're going to want to see what happens. Until then, remember, keep your records, keep your ground, and don't let anyone tell you that what you've built doesn't matter. See you next time.